The 2024 Pro Farmer Crop Tour is presented by Pioneer, combining cutting-edge research with one of the largest local testing programs in the industry to help farmers succeed. Pioneer, what's next happens here. By Zetavo soybean seed, distributed exclusively by BASF, and by New Leaf Symbiotics, science-led, performance-driven, and data-backed, offering biostimulants for corn, soy, cotton, and peanuts, and a revolutionary new bioinsecticide for corn rootworm. The international sponsor for Crop Tour is the U.S. Soybean Export Council. Crop Tour 24 is also supported by RCIS, by Case IH, by Meristem Crop Performance, by Sweetwater Technologies, by Farm Credit Services of America, by Firestone, by Morton Buildings, by Nutrien ESN, and by BW Fusion.
Hello and welcome to Night 1 of Crop Tour Live. I'm Clinton Griffiths, the host of Ag Day and editor of Farm Journal Magazine. We are so excited to kick off another great year of the Pro Farmer Crop Tour. Right now, scouts from the eastern leg of the tour are gathering in Noblesville, Indiana, and in the west, in Grand Island, Nebraska, grabbing some grub, talking about what they saw on day one of the tour. Now, like you, they're all waiting to hear what those scouts found for Ohio and South Dakota based on their findings in the field. And those numbers are coming up in just a few moments. But before we get to those, let's bring in our tour leaders in the east. As always, it's Pro Farmer editor Brian Grady, and in the west, host of AgriTalk, Chip Flory. Guys, we're just a couple minutes away from revealing those yield numbers of the tour, but let's give some quick insights into what you saw today. Brian, we'll start with you out in the east.
Very good crops in Ohio again this year. Last year was the gold standard in the state, and it's close this year. They have really good crops, heavily potted soybeans, good corn crop for the most part. There's more variability, I think, than what we saw last year in Ohio.
Yeah, Chip, if we talk about out in South Dakota, kind of an interesting state every year, depending on what you find. What did you see today?
Yeah, another interesting year in South Dakota. There's no question about it. The holes in the field, the drowned out spots, the ponded out areas, that's putting a big question in my mind about what the impact of that is going to be on the South Dakota corn and soybean crop. We saw that in a lot of places. We saw a corn crop that had two very different planting dates. So we've got two very different corn crops growing in South Dakota too. And then beans, doggone it, a year ago, yes, it was dry. The beans, though, they were filling. They had done a lot of the work that they needed to do a year ago right now. This year, that bean crop's got a ton of work to do to realize its potential.
Yeah, Brian, talk to me about drought and dryness. Obviously, Ohio's dealt with some of that this year. Did you see much of that on tour?
Yeah, some are the southeast of Dublin, Columbus. That area is dealing with some dryness. Actually, they had too much moisture early on up in the northwest portion, and so we're seeing effects of that, and that comes with some of the variability I talked to. Probably more so than what we saw last year, because it was pretty uniform last year. And this year, there's some ups and downs, and quite a bit of ups and downs in some of those areas.
What about variability for you, Chip? Much of that, as you went across there, obviously we've had some rain. There are some flooded areas.
Oh, yeah. We started off south of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, with so much potential because our first 4 stops in corn were between 170 and 175 bushels per acre. It just felt like it was going to be one of those years that we were going to find that consistent crop. But it faded from us as we made our way to the south, and we saw a lot of variability in the last 6 or 7 stops in South Dakota.
All right, well, let's get straight to those numbers. It's 8 o'clock Central Time, and time to reveal the numbers as promised. We'll start out in the east with you, Brian. Corn and soybeans in Ohio.
Absolutely. Corn, 183.29. And on the soybean pod counts in the 3 by square, 1229.93.
Okay, we'll unpack all those numbers in just a second. Let's get to South Dakota for you, Chip.
You bet. 156.5 for the South Dakota corn yield, down 0.58%. And pod counts, 1,025.9, up. There's our first up 1.27%.
All right, well, let's start in South Dakota since we have those numbers up, guys. Chip, what about these numbers surprise you? What is kind of the key takeaway here?
Okay, we lost some ears. Our ear count was down from a year ago, but we made up for that with the grain length. We had a longer ear, longer grain inches on this year's crop, and that's where we made it up. The kernel rose around basically about the same as what it was a year ago. So we lost some ears, but we made it up with grain length, and we're looking at a corn crop that's basically the same as it was a year ago. Soybeans, we're up only 1.27% on the pods in a 3 by 3 foot square, but I think it was a really different bean crop that we were looking at this year. Last year, it was what it was. It wasn't going to get any bigger, but we didn't have a feel that we were going to lose a lot on that crop either. This year, that bean crop up in South Dakota could go either way. It's got a lot of work to do, and if it doesn't get it done, then it's probably not going to be last year's bean crop.
Chip, compare this to what USDA said last week. How does this compare to what they forecast for us as far as what we saw? Obviously, this is potential yield, right? We're not there yet.
Yeah.
How does and also maturity? How do we stack up on maturity here?
Yeah, maturity's all over the board. Last year it was much more consistent. It was much more further along, but USDA had the South Dakota crop at 162, up 6.6% from a year ago. I didn't find that. The tour didn't find that. 156.5, down about 0.6%. And then the bean crop, South Dakota, 47 bushels per acre, would be up 6.8% from a year ago. If it can realize that potential and it gets enough moisture to finish off that crop, and you know what? Let's give it a few days on the end of the growing season too, a little bit further than go past that normal first frost date. Give it a few extra days on the growing season, then I'll believe that bean crop is 5%, 6% better than what it was a year ago. But it needs some rain and it needs some time.
All right, Brian, let's talk about Ohio, and we'll start with corn. Did the number surprise you compared to what we were expecting last year? A big number. This year, right there.
Right there, and that did surprise me a little bit. USDA had Ohio at 188, down 5.1%, and we were down 0.4% from a year ago. I mentioned it before, just didn't see the consistency that we saw across Ohio last year. I don't think this year's Ohio crop is what it was last year, to be honest with you. Chip talked about the difference in the ear counts out there. We actually had higher ear counts, and so there's more ears out there, but the grain length is less. And so those kind of offset each other, and you end up with 0.4% down from what we found on crop tour last year. This is all going to be about some of the disease out here, tar spot, and how much that takes out of the yield into the finish. And we'll see how much of the yield potential that we measured actually gets into the bin.
All right, so talk soybeans for us. Similar story or different story for beans?
Well, the soybean crop, actually, me personally, on my route, I was more impressed with soybeans than I was with corn this year. Down 1.8% on the pods in a 3 by 3 square, and USDA had the yield. So we're talking apples and oranges kind of there with yield versus pod counts, but they had the yield at 59, up 1.7%. There's a lot of pods out there in Ohio, no doubt about it. I think the one takeaway that I remember is the moisture is greater this year than what it was last year. And so a heavily potted crop with moisture in the third week of August has a lot of yield potential. And a lot of that crop is going to get to the finish line. Now, the areas that don't have them, they're going to struggle a little bit more if they don't get some late season rains. But for a good portion of this crop, that heavily potted crop does have soil moisture to get it to the finish line.
All right, well, it's an interesting first look at what's going on in the eastern and western legs. Guys, we're going to come back in just a second and let you ask questions of each other. But what led our tour leaders to come up with these numbers, or what did the samples show us there? Let's get a better look at what the scouts saw on the ground. In the west on day one, scouts started the day in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, ending in Grand Island, Nebraska. Farm Journal's Michelle Rook is following the tour for us.
Despite heavy rains and flooding early in the season here in southeastern South Dakota, crop scouts are finding consistent corn yields, making USDA's record yield projections achievable, while soybeans may fall short due to high variability in pod counts. The historic flooding right after Father's Day in the southeast definitely left its mark.
You can see the washed out areas, the flooded out areas, and it seems like every field's got a problem of some sort.
Centerville farmer Craig Anderson received 18 inches of rain in 48 hours, destroying many of his fields, and he wasn't alone.
Using the satellite stuff, that we figured it was over 40,000 acres just in this area, just right alongside of the Vermilion River.
Acres that weren't zeroed out will see lower yields from increased weed pressure, variable maturity, and pod counts.
They might be down 10 or 15%. Just from all the low spots that are going to be drowned out.
A year ago, our pod counts in South Dakota were 1,013. We started off in the 1,300 range, but we've also been as low as 400.
So he says that makes hitting USDA's 47 bushel yield target tough.
I'm not seeing anything that makes me think it's a 47 bushel bean crop in South Dakota.
Scout Tim Gregerson found more uniformity in the corn, despite a sample that just pollinated last week.
I see a lot of consistent corn.
He encountered a few surprises, though, with southern rust and no signs of nitrogen loss from the heavy rains early.
So far, the color of the corn's pretty good here. The holes are evident. They're a little bit bigger than normal in this area of South Dakota than a normal year, the drowned out spots. But it's amazing how tight we've seen the yields between 170 and 174.
But is it the record 162 BPA yield USDA predicted for the state?
Looking at the potholes, you know that's going to take some out. So then you go to that ear count on the good spots. The ear count's been consistent enough that it's definitely possible.
Plus, he says the northern half of South Dakota may make up for the deficits in the southeast. I'm Michelle Rook reporting for Ag Day.
All right, thanks, Michelle. In the east, crews travel from Dublin, Ohio to Noblesville, Indiana. Farm Journal's Tyne Morgan has the latest from that leg of the tour.
As Pro Farmer Crop Tour scouts set out on day one in the east, it's an area that saw a jump start to planting this year.
We started planting our beans on the 16th of April, finished on the 25th, started planting corn on the 26th, finished on the 30th, and we'd never been done planting that early before.
Michael Valerie farms in south central Ohio. The early start was promising, but then drought set in.
Our yields this year are going to be less than last year. We've basically had the top cut off of our crop by the fact that we've received about 5 inches less moisture than normal.
The biggest concern in parts of Ohio this year is this. According to the latest U.S. Drought Monitor, 59% of Ohio is currently seeing some level of dryness. 1 year ago, that number was only 11%.
So far, the drought has affected corn more than beans.
Valerie says farmers know they're probably not going to see the record yields they harvested last year. But as Pro Farmer editor Brian Grady got into the cornfields and started peeling back the ears,
96 was the ear count.
he uncovered a resilient crop.
In terms of what's normal out here in Ohio over the years that we've seen on Crop Tour, this is an above average year.
Grady has led the eastern leg of the tour for nearly 20 years, and he knew after last year's phenomenal corn crop in Ohio, he wouldn't find as good of a crop as he measured last year. But he still thinks this year's corn yields could be in the top 3 for the state.
When comparing it to last year, that was the record yield in the state and the gold standard, and just a phenomenal corn crop last year in Ohio. So probably not going to quite live up to those standards, but it's a very good corn crop here based on what we've seen so far.
Grady says they've seen a consistent corn crop, but when it comes to Ohio's beans,
this is going to be a pretty darn good Ohio bean crop out here.
he's even more impressed.
A heavily potted crop that has moisture in the third week of August is probably going to yield pretty well. And I think that that's what we're looking at so far on our route.
All right, thanks, Tyne. All right, Chip, Brian, now that you've seen some footage from the other side of the tour, let me have you ask each other a couple of questions. Chip, what are you curious to ask Brian about what he saw out east?
Is the corn crop this year almost as good as it was a year ago? That's what the numbers showed us, Brian. Is it going to be there?
Almost. Yeah, I can use the term almost, and I feel good about that. As good, no. I don't doesn't have the consistency, so that's where you struggle. But there's some really big numbers out here. Just not enough of them probably to offset some of the holes that we have and that we saw. Honest with you, and by holes I don't mean holes in field. I just mean like the consistency. The ear counts are really good. I'm impressed with the here. The grain length isn't always there. We had some tip back issues and stuff like that. We had some pressure that's going to shut down some of these fields prematurely. Those types of things, and that's why I think it doesn't live up to last year's crop.
Okay. All right. Yeah, there are some concerns out there. Is the bottom line there? It is there. Yeah. There are some issues that could come up and maybe take the top end off that crop that you saw.
Yeah, for sure. Now, Brian, from what you saw out west, what are your questions?
Well, so I had driven through South Dakota about 3 weeks ago, and you know, from the road, it's pretty stark, some of the washouts and stuff like that. As you get out in there, was it more alarming to you, more pronounced than what you expected, or was the same, or was it not bad?
Okay. So when I made my way over to Sioux Falls, I took I-90, and along I-90, the southern Minnesota crop is full of holes, like we've been talking about. I expected that it was going to be better once I got into South Dakota, and I'm not too sure if it was, guys. There's a lot of holes that are going to need to be accounted for, and everybody knows what happens when you're sitting in the combine looking at the yield monitor, and it takes a while to build that whole field average up. And as soon as you go through a spot where there's zero, it takes that average down very quickly, and it takes a long time to build it up. So it's going to have an impact out there. There's no question.
Guys, as we talk about tomorrow, obviously we got to start thinking ahead to where you're headed, Nebraska, the rest of Indiana into Illinois. Brian, we'll start with you. You've kind of got supposed to be the sweet spot here. What are you expecting to see, or what are you looking for tomorrow?
Well, better see some good crops, to be honest with you. I mean, when you look at USDA's August estimates, 5 of the 7 states that we're on in crop tour have record yields, and Ohio, one of those. Now we're getting into the states that are expected to have record yields. Indiana tomorrow, then we'll get Illinois, and then into Iowa. And so those 3 states really need to carry.
What about for you, Chip? What are you looking for tomorrow?
Yeah, everything south of the Platte River and east of Grand Island as we make our way over to Nebraska City. We saw some hail damage today in South Dakota and northeast Nebraska, but we're going to see a pile of it tomorrow. There's just no question about it. So we're going to be looking for some of the disease issues, try to put a number, try to put a factor on just how much damage is out there from the hail and how much of an impact that might have on the whole state. So it's an important day. Also, there's an area in south of Lincoln a ways that has been missed by rain, and it's gotten very dry in a relatively small area, but still we'll get into some drought tomorrow as we make our way over to Nebraska City.
All right, fellas, sure appreciate you joining us here for night 1 of Crop Tour Live. We'll let you head back to the room to field some questions from the crowd there. Meanwhile, the Farm Journal Weather Department also looking ahead to tomorrow for scouts out on the tour. Meteorologist Jack Van Meter has the forecast for Tuesday.
For the Crop Tour Eastern leg, where we're going to be going from Noblesville, Indiana, all the way out to Bloomington, Illinois, great news. Perfect travel weather, and honestly, just perfect weather to be outside as well. As I put this graphic in motion, we could see no rain whatsoever through Wednesday. And actually, this part of the country, especially in the Great Lakes region, is going to be dry for much of the next coming days, even close to a week, which is great news. Unfortunately, though, for the western leg of the journey, not going to be as dry. We are going to be seeing some showers and actually some thunderstorms moving in from Grand Island all the way over to Nebraska City throughout, especially the early to mid afternoon. We could be just seeing some of those light showers moving in and actually a couple of rumbles of thunder as well.
All right, the western leg looks like it could get a little wet. And now this is just day one of the Pro Farmer Crop Tour. Tomorrow, the scouts in the east travel from Indiana to Illinois, as we said, and in the west, focus will be on Nebraska. Make sure to join us back here again tomorrow night at 8 o'clock Central. We'll bring you the latest results from the tour.